What's good, YouTube? It's me, by Squiddy, back in another Squidio. Let's talk about Handtraps for a second because we're getting a new ban list. A Rise Heart has been banned, Dragon Links have been hit. There's obviously going to be a big shift in the metagame. So without further ado, we have 4 categories. We have Amazing up at the top, which are absolutely sensational hand traps that everyone should be playing. We have the playable hand traps. We have Mid, which is kind of like, kind of playable, but not great. And then Bad, which is basically unplayable. So, starting at the top. Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, obviously this one is a no-brainer that it's still an amazing. I mean, it's not necessarily amazing against every matchup, right? Like, it's not going to be backbreaking against all of the matchups, but I still think it's good enough to be main decking right now because it has universal application against every deck. We all know that Yugioh has a plethora of searching, special summoning from deck. A lot of things resolve with the deck in mind, so having a hand trap that keeps them all in check is just super important. On top of it being a level 3 tuner, you know, you can sometimes make use of it, make like a Baron and a Fleur in the right deck. I think this is the type of hand trap that should be main decked right now in every deck, personally, especially at the beginning of the format where no one really knows what exactly to expect. So we'll leave it there for now. Next, we have the BYSTIALS. I think these cards are between playable and mid right now. There's just not any crazy matchups that they're absolutely broken against. For example, against Unchained, they're decently playable, but it was more so having the secondary effects being in application. For example, with Magnuma, you can kind of search Druid's Worm in the end phase, so you instantly get 2 bodies. And with Druid's Worm, it's actually not bad against Unchained because you're able to put that on board, get rid of something like the Unchained Yama from the graveyard, and also have a body on the board that threatens to send something to the graveyard, so they can't easily get it off the table. If they try to link with it, we can use the effect of Druid's Worm to get rid of something on the field. So in my opinion, it's pretty playable right now, but it's between mid because in the other matchups, it doesn't really have a lot of crossover. We don't really want to play it against something like a Purely, right? I mean, we're talking about the best decks that are remaining in the format right now. Probably Unchained and Purely are the first 2 that we have to think about beating. It's still decent against some of the other rogue matchups, so like Branded or against Chimera. So let's put it in playable for now, but it could range between mid depending on the deck. It's definitely more of a side deck card though. For the Contact C, I think this is probably somewhat of a mid card. It's decently good when you play against Purely and they actually don't main deck any generic Link 2s to get rid of it, so it's just like they end their entire turn by slapping this on the table. But against the other matchups, it's not that great, and if Purely is happening to play something like an IP Masquerena or a Donner, which a lot of players are, especially now that they're playing cards like Fanmer, which Donner allows you to kind of clear your field when you do have some monsters on the table like Nib. And I think the fact that people are trending towards playing more generic Link 2s mean this card is worse than ever. And against the other matchups, it's just not very good. Against Unchained, it's not great. They can just easily link it off into their Soul of Rage. Against the fusion decks, they can easily fuse into Guardian Chimera with it. So let's just put it into mid for now. But honestly, it could probably be bad as well. But the fact that you do have a chance of nerfing a Purely player, I think we will put it in mid. Dimensional Shifter, this is a no-brainer. It's obviously amazing, but the issue is with this hand trap, there are not a lot of decks that can actually sustain playing this besides something like a Flunderies, which comes to mind, or potentially any Kashtira stragglers that are still playing the deck, which I actually think the deck is decently good. We made a video about it yesterday talking about the different variations that you can play, and the fact that D-Shifter is just an auto-win hand trap in the current state of Yu-Gi-Oh! Means that it has to be an amazing card, and decks like Kashtira that can actually play it without any recourse or weakness probably means that, you know what, they might be playable just because of this one hand trap, right? Droll and Lockbird, this one's a bit controversial. We already know what happened about me talking about Droll and Lockbird being bad, but let's put it in mid for now. I mean, it's obviously playable, but the thing is, it depends on the matchup. Against a lot of matchups, it's very mid. Against Purely's and Unchained, it's quite mid. Especially against Unchained, it's reasonably bad. But if you're playing a deck like Vanadium or even like Flunderies, which happened to win the YCS, then in that case, it's definitely playable. So I would say between playable and mid, let's just put it on the high section of the mid because this is still a card that we can sustain in the side deck. It's one of the cards that are a lot of people's go-to, especially at the beginning of a format, because it's just a safe option that covers a variety of matchups. So that's the nice thing about Droll and Lockbird. It's just a very wide net that casts a net across a variety of different matchups, but it's just not necessarily backbreaking against a lot of them. So that's kind of the issue, personally, that I found with Droll. I will put it in mid for now, but I can see it flying up to playable as a side deck option, especially now that the format has just begun. Next, let's talk about Ghost Spell. I think this card is definitely Probably right now it's on the low end of mid. It's not really sustainable against any relevant matchups. It's not really hitting Unchained or Purely directly. It's probably only hitting Labyrinth right now at the top of the targets that this card actually affects in the metagame. So for that reason, I think it's probably between mid and bad. But it's very good against Labyrinths because you are able to hit Big Welcome Labyrinths, which can actually ruin their entire turn 1 setup or be very, very effective on your turn to be able to push through their entire board. So let's leave it there for now. Phantasmay, in my opinion, is a high playable because this is a card that we've been hyping on this channel in particular for a long time. Now, the thing with Phantasmay that I love is the fact that it puts a body onto the board that negates things that would target. So against Unchained, not only are you able to dig for your other powerful hand traps like Nibiru, the Rock, or potentially D-Shifter if you're playing a D-Shifter-esque deck, but this card also allows you to fix your hand, put back bricks, and then put a 2400 body on the board for free. That also has the handy effect of negating anything that might try to link off with it, and then having the 24 to try and beat over like an Unchained Soul of Rage during your turn, for example. So I quite like this card. It has a lot of crossovers against some of the best decks, against Rescue Ace, against Salamangreat, against a lot of rogue decks that take advantage of links. And now that Kashtira is gone, that's one less XYZ deck that we have to worry about. So now people will be probably playing a variety of different decks that encompass link monsters, and that's where Phantasmay really shines, in my opinion, in the side deck. So I definitely think that this is where it belongs. Next, let's talk about Skullmeister. This is a hand trap that I feel like a lot of people have actually forgotten about, and I will put it in the playable section because I think it's quite effective against the Unchained matchup in particular. What Skullmeister does is it negates the effect of a card in the graveyard, which means that you will be able to negate the traps and the spells that activate in the graveyard trying to special summon from deck, meaning that you would effectively be playing more copies of Ash Blossom because Ash Blossom more or less fulfills that exact same purpose in that matchup. However, Ash is a little better because you can still hit Tour Guide from the Underworld, whereas Skullmeister can only hit card effects that activate in the graveyard. The other thing to note is that Skullmeister cannot actually activate in the damage step any longer. I know back in the day, like about 10 years ago, there was a TCG exclusive ruling that said Skullmeister can activate in the graveyard. However, that has been errated to my knowledge that you can no longer use it. So if you are swinging over something by battle, you cannot attempt to negate the destruction effect in the graveyard that special summons for an Unchained monster from the deck, or a Yama effect in the graveyard, for example. But the card I still think is decently solid, being a Fiend that you can fuse with in a deck like Chimera to go into your big Chimera. Being a level 4 as well with 1700 attack is quite relevant for going into your XYZ plays, or just normal summoning as a beater in crucial board states where you actually need that 1700 attack to come in clutch. It does come in more handy than you would think. Like, think about all the hand traps that we have now. Most of them are 0 attack. They don't really do anything in terms of battle phase, but having a Skullmeister being able to actually threaten potentially a card on the field, or like in the grind game swing for damage, is really, really useful. And I just like how the card does a lot. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a lot of crossover, again, is the only issue. You can actually use it against niche matchups like Tearlaments, though, to negate the name in the graveyard. The other benefit of this against Tearlaments is it actually negates the Shufflers as well as the Millers. So being able to negate a Kelbeck or an Yugioh in the graveyard, I think is just absolutely crazy. It's like another copy of Ash in that matchup as well for that exact purpose. So that's why we're going to put it in playable for now. Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, this is a fairly fun one that I think is between mid and playable. The issue with Ghost Reaper is that, number one, you have to have a plethora of extra deck space, which is just not the case in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Most of the decks do rely heavily on their extra deck, so having like a very tight extra deck means that you can't necessarily play this card. But it's very good in the decks that you do have the space. So in a deck like Vanquish Soul or potentially Kashtira, you can side a lot of the problematic monsters in the actual format and add them to your extra deck, and then have Ghost Reaper to hedge against those matchups. In certain matchups like Unchained, you can hit something like an Unchained Soul of Yama. Unfortunately, if their hand is good, they're still going to be able to put up a board with Escape plus the Soul of Rage, and potentially even a DDD High King Caesar, depending on their hand. And also against the other matchups is actually just a blowout. So against the Chimera Fusion deck, if you actually hit the main Chimera, then that means they're not going to be able to recur the effect of Chimera Fusion back to their hand, and effectively their entire strategy basically crumbles. Their only one play is going into the Guardian Chimera. So this actually does a lot against a certain matchups, but I think the problem is you obviously have to side or main deck a bunch of different extra deck monsters. Against Purely, you can hit the X Purely Noir, but they're still going to be able to put up a beauty and still have hand traps. So like all the matchups that this actually works against, it does not auto win by any means. It's going to whittle down their main combo. It's a lot like Drone Lockbird, where it can be either decently good or decently bad depending on their hand. Half the time they're still going to be able to put up some semblance of a board, and you will be down one card. So that's just one thing to worry about, I think, when it comes to this card. But I definitely think it's something everyone could experiment with, and let me know if this card is actually good or not. DD Crow, I will say, is probably in the mid section right now, but I'll put it in the high mid because I actually quite like this card. I think it has a lot of crossover against different matchups. You can use it against Tearlaments, you can use it against Purely when they use the Pure Lily to target a spell card in their graveyard. Even against Unchained, it has that niche interaction where you can either hit the Yama in the grind game, or you can hit something like a Shyama trying to bring itself back from the graveyard, so it can be a little bit of an impact. Against Chimera, you can hit something like the Chimera Fusion or potentially the Sword Knight if they're trying to resurrect it off of Baphomet. But the issue is none of these plays are particularly backbreaking. It's not great of a card. It's not like a card like Ash Blossom, which should potentially win you the game on the spot. This is typically a card that's effectively live halfway through the combo, so like midway when they're already amassing the resources, when they're already past the critical choke point for their actual combo. So I don't think this card is that great to side right now, but if you are looking for an option and this card does happen to fit with your deck, being like a Dark Winged Beast for whatever reason, level 1, then perhaps it's definitely something we can consider. In a deck like Flunneries, you can also search it off of Rabina, so that's something else to consider as well. PSYFRAME-GEAR Gamma is at 1, so let's just put it in, well, it's between mid and bad, honestly. The issue with this card is obviously at 1, it doesn't really do enough to justify playing a normal vanilla brick. I mean, obviously the card on its own is absolutely amazing, but we have to look at it from the bigger perspective and see like what the benefits and the drawbacks of this card are. But in a deck like Dragon Link, where you're actually making use of the vanilla, so you're taking dual usage of the actual package, being able to send it off of the Red Eyes Meteor Dragon, then in that case, I think it's definitely playable. But I'm going to put it in mid right now because in the larger picture of the metagame, I don't think it's a card that we would necessarily want to play when we do have to play the one driver to pair with it. But, you know, on its own, again, it is an absolutely amazing card, which is why it was limited to begin with. Chaos Hunter is probably a bad card right now. It's just not doing enough to justify discarding one card. I mean, it's very nice to get a 2500 body onto the board, and there are a lot of decks that do use marginal effects for banishing, but now that Kashtira is kind of out of the favor, and there aren't a lot of like exclusively banishing decks, I just don't think that the card is justifiably run right now. You could still play it in something like Sprite to special summon off of the Mannequin Cat if you do face a deck that plays D-Shifter, but in my opinion, I just don't think in a wider range, looking at the card from a high level, it's that good, so we will put it in bad for now. Ghost Ogre is probably between bad and mid. We'll say bad right now. It does hit certain matchups. Obviously, against Purely, you can hit the field spell or potentially the My Friend Purely, but the issue is if they do have the Happy Memory, then they could just protect whatever you're trying to destroy, so it's very bad in that situation. You can still try and hit the Black Cat, which can sometimes come up as well. It's decently good. It's a lot better than DD Crow in that case. And against decks like Flunneries or certain rogue decks, you can definitely hit the field spell or anything that activates. But I think it's definitely between mid and bad because there's just not enough matchups to justify it being good. Like all the matchups are currently mid against. It's maybe good against Flunneries, but it doesn't hit enough matchups, and there are always cards better to side against that particular matchup as well as other matchups in mind. Retaliating C, I will say, is between mid and playable right now. The issue with this card is that it's not that great against the decks that it's great against unless it's called Chimera. Against Chimera, it's obviously an insane card because you're banishing all of the resources, including the Chimera Fusion, which stays on the table until the chain resolves, by which time Retaliating C would hit the table, and that would banish the Chimera Fusion. But against the other matchups, it's just not as great as it originally is. I thought this card was actually insane against Purely, but after testing it out, I realized as long as they have access to the bubbly memory, the pretty memory, then they're going to be able to go into beauty. They're going to be able to negate the effect of the Retaliating C on your side of the table, and then they're going to be able to send something to attach to Retaliating C. So it doesn't really matter that much. It's like a mini shifter that can be used against the first spell card, but against Purely, it doesn't really matter as long as they have access to the beauty, which is fairly easy. Then the card just doesn't do enough, in my opinion, and you're not going to be able to search for the contact C neither, because they're going to be equipping it as a material instead of sending it to the graveyard, right? So that's just what I think about the card, but I will say it's very good against Chimera in particular. So if Chimera and Branded definitely get popular, then this is the type of card we could for sure keep in mid. Also, if people are still playing runic stuff, this card could be decently good against them as well. So let's keep it as a high mid between playables right now. Nibiru, in my opinion, is definitely, I will say it's amazing because it's between playable and amazing. The issue with this card is that if people are playing around Nibiru, then it's not very good. But the nice thing is, even though a lot of decks can sort of play around it, for example, like Unchained, it still does its job, especially when you pair it with other cards. When you pair this card with another hand trap, or you pair it with any semblance of engine, especially in the grind game, there are not a lot of decks that can actually play around Nibiru in the grind game. They're trying to break past your board, they're trying to mount their own play, and you have cards in addition to Nibiru. So they really can't consider playing around Nibiru effectively without considering your other cards. There's no way for them to break your board and also put up their own board without playing in a Nib. So that's where I really like Nib. And then on turn 1, turn 0, being paired with another hand trap means that they can't effectively play around it. Even when Unchained can play around it with something like a tour guide, it's still making it so that their board is a lot weaker than it would have been if we did not have the Nib. So in my opinion, I quite like it for that reason. Obviously, it's very terrible against decks like Flunderies and Purely, but that's alright. Against the other matchups, for the most part, every deck is going to be summoning 5 or more times, especially in the grind game, so I think it's somewhat playable. It's still live against Flunderies and Purely. We're not saying it's completely dead. There are moments where Flunderies actually normal summon 5 times or more during the turn, especially when they're trying to play past the board with Mega Raiza, or against Purely when they are going into all the shenanigans and potentially trying to dig with Sylvan Princess Sprite, then this card could definitely come up. And then Lancea, this is mostly here for a couple of formats ago, but it's no-brainer. That card is pretty bad. But the nice thing about this is it actually does have some usage against decks like the Flunderies deck. You can actually stop them from banishing their birds and recurring them back, stop them from using cards like Map as well, and stop them from using the quick play. Obviously, that could be chained, but who knows, they might be able to dig off of the pot, which again was nice because this stops the pot. So if you shotgun this, it stops them from using a lot of cards to dig for their engine as well. But I just don't think it's very good against the other decks in the format, just like Chaos Hunter, so we'll keep it at bad for now. And then the last but not least, a couple of cards here. Effect Veiler, Infinite Impermanence, and Mourner. We'll say that Imperm on its own is definitely an amazing card because it's so generically good. You can draw it as your 6th card and use it on a monster that's kind of floodgating the board. For example, DDD High King Caesar or like a Nightmare Griffin. And this card is very clutch when you do top deck it as a 6th card. If you don't top deck it, it's quite nice as well going 2nd because it's effectively a card that can be interacted with by Triple Tactics Talent nor Triple Tactics Thrust, which seemingly has picked up a huge surge in popularity recently. So guys, having a hand trap that actually interacts with your opponent and prevents them from activating that card means that, you know, this is half the time it's really amazing. It's really good. They're having Dead Thrust, Dead Tactics talents in their hand that they can't use, and I just love how this card just doesn't interact with those cards, nor does it interact with cards like Called by the Grave, and I will place it in amazing for now. For a Ghost Mourner, I'm going to put this into high playable. The nice thing about this card is that it does hit a lot of things in the draw phase, like Imperm does, whereas Veiler doesn't. So against a deck like Purely, where they're trying to play around something like a Drone Lockbird and they're playing in the draw phase, we can actually Mourner the Black Cat, which is very high impact. The other nice thing is this obviously causes them to take burn damage, so in a time-based situation where they have to link off a monster or synchro off, they're either going to have to make a difficult decision to either play super fast and take the damage or just not use that monster's material, period. So that niche utility is actually really nice to have. The only caveat is this only works on special summon monsters, so against normal summon decks like Flunderies, which is going to pick up in popularity because they just won YCS Cancun, it means that this card is effectively dead. It's null and void. You cannot use it against normal summon monsters. You cannot use it against something like a tour guide from the underworld, which I, by the way, still think it's correct to use an Imperm or a Veiler on a tour guide against Unchained for the sole fact that even if they do have the Sarama, it doesn't really matter, or the Shavara rather. If they have it, they have it, but if they don't, they're probably going to pass their turn. So that's why I really like using it against tour guide personally. But I would love to hear your guys' thoughts and comments on that as an outlier, but different topic for a different time. And then Effect Veiler, I think it's between amazing and playable. We'll just put it in playable right now. I think the issue with Veiler is that, again, it can only be used in the main phase. It's not super effective against certain cards in the format, and it kind of has like that mid-esque feel. You can't really use it if you top deck it as your 6th card, whereas Mourner, you can still use it on your turn if they summon something out on our turn. And then Veiler is just like, it has niche usage. It's a monster that kind of gets hit by Triple Tactics Talent, Triple Tactics Thrust, And well, that's about all I really have to say about the card. I feel like it's still decently playable though, especially if Flunderies sees a surge in popularity, then we could definitely add this back to our deck and hit the Robina, which prevents them from potentially Featherstorming if they don't actually have access to the map nor the quick play spell card, and they do have a Featherstorm in their hand or Thrustable. So that's about it, all I had for this video. If you guys have any other hand traps that we're missing out on, definitely let us know in the comments below. Or if you guys think that some of these cards should be in different categories, definitely let us know. I would love to hear your thoughts. And other than that, we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.